Namaste, fist bump, Angus here. Today we're going to cover, is Lumen any good for an endurance athlete? And I'm going to use myself as an example because I'm doing a little experiment just now, which is running a half marathon with just 1 month's worth of training. So yesterday I did a 15k. My body weight in the morning was 99 kilos and I ran the whole thing in barefoot shoes. And then next week I should have the half marathon on Saturday to do. So we're just going to run through my stats and how I use Lumen and see what kind of information you can take out of it. So guys, I'm just interjecting quickly in this video with a quick piece. I'm editing the video. It's actually in 2 parts and it might not make a lot of sense right there. So the second part's all about your crossover point. Crossover point's when you start relying on more carbohydrates, particularly in an endurance event. And before the crossover point, you're using mainly fat, and the crossover point is kind of the zone 2-ish area that I harp on about. The reason I can do a half marathon, or the reason I'm going to attempt a half marathon, I think I'm cocky enough to be able to do a half marathon with just a month's worth of training, is my zone 2 and my cardio is actually really good. Most of this month has been about developing foot conditioning to be able to do impact, because most of my training has been on bikes. And although I'm not doing massive distance on the bike, I'm very regular on the bike. And my zone 2, I'm just keeping it topped up, and occasionally I try and spur it up. So I'm holding about 170 watts at zone 2. When I first started, I was a little over 100, and that was 2 years ago. So zone 2 has been pivotal in improving the kind of human condition. The other thing I want to preface is with the Lumen, you can see how insulin sensitive you are. So even if you're doing your race zone 2 or more intense, if you're doing more intense, you're going to need more carbohydrates. But if you need more carbohydrates, you might use up more carbohydrates. So depending on how many carbohydrates you take during your event, if you take none, after the event, you're going to be very insulin sensitive, or you should be very insulin sensitive. So what you could do is, say you go out for an hour run, you burn through a ton of carbohydrates. How many grams of carbohydrates can you make disappear? If you're eating carbohydrates and they're showing in your Lumen shortly after, that means your body's burning those carbohydrates rather than storing those carbohydrates. So what I would like to see for a lot of people is they maybe eat 50 grams of carbohydrates, and it shouldn't show in your Lumen because your body should be storing it because you've just used it in your event. Particularly if that event was hard, even if it's zone 2 and beyond, you're using a lot of carbohydrates, maybe 50% carbohydrates, maybe 70% carbohydrates, maybe even up to 90% carbohydrates, and depending on how many carbohydrates you took on. And that way you can kind of see how many carbohydrates. So I'm fairly well fat adapted. I took, for my 2-hour run, I took about 20 grams of carbohydrates on the run. And for the rest of the day, however, I was craving carbohydrates, so that's something to watch out for. So that's just my quick introduction. Back onto the video, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and I'll check you guys soon. So a few metrics that I like to check, first of all, is HRV. I was using the Whoop. So I went out for a run on the Wednesday. That morning, my HRV was 144. It dipped the next day, as would happen, so I used 2 rest days because I knew that would help peak my HRV. And then the morning of the run, I think it was like 170 something, which was pretty good, and it was also the highest HRV in Scotland that day, so that's awesome. Anyway, I was ready to go. I took my morning measurements in the morning with the Lumen, and I got a 4 when I woke up, but I didn't wake up. I had done some morning cardio, if you know what I mean. So stayed in bed. When I got up, I did a retake and I was a 2 in the morning. Happy with that. I was kind of planning to be a 2, and I'll come to why that's good for me running, because I knew I'd kind of carved up the night before. So if I'm blowing a 2, it means those carbohydrates are locked into my muscles, and as I woke up a little bit heavier, nearly a kilo heavier the next day, I know I've got plenty of water in my body, and I know I've got plenty of carbohydrates in my body, and you can kind of feel that. And so if you're getting a low number of Lumen and your body weight is up, it's probably a good time to do some endurance work. If you are getting higher numbers in the morning, it's really not a bother, because you got those carbohydrates in your system, which you're really needing to use for endurance work, even if you are fairly fat adapted. My pre-measurement was a 3. And then when I came back from the run, I did a quick measurement. I like to do a measurement just kind of 5 minutes after my heart rate come down, and I was a 3. And then I waited the full half an hour that Lumen recommends, and I was back down to 2, which is great. So let's go into this in a little bit more detail. So I do most of my cardio fasted because that's just my preferred way of doing it, like the carb up the night before, or at least have carbohydrates in the system. And then I like to do the run fasted because I don't really like anything in my tummy when I'm running. I did have some cordyceps mushrooms from Ape Nutrition. I really like that brand and I really like their cordyceps mushrooms. I don't take many supplements. Cordyceps mushrooms, after I do something really long endurance-y, is something I take. I just find it gives you almost like a third lung. And I also went with some jelly babies, which are about 5 grams of carbs each jelly baby. I don't like jelly babies. They're just super high simple carbohydrates, super high glucose, and each one is dosed at 5 grams, so you know exactly how much you're having. So I had about 4 jelly babies total on the run. Had that about an hour in. I don't like to eat when I run because I feel my stomach acid kind of creeps up and starts doing some weird stuff. After the run, my heart rate recovery, this is recorded with the analytic or athletic app for Apple Watch, which is great, and that's my heart rate recovery. It's not as good. I'm normally over 60 beats, but it was a long run, so my heart rate was a bit stressed after it. And then my cardio fitness, which is the same as your VO2 max, the way Apple Watch measures it, is pretty high, which is pretty good because I'm a heavy person, even though I'm not running particularly fast. So when you record an activity with, say, Apple Health, the Lumen will give you afterwards, but you can always put into Lumen how long you're going to go out running for. So for my run was 2 hours 21 minutes. As I said, not the fastest runner in the world. It gave me 5 portions of carbs. Each portion of carbs is 15 grams. Something I would like Lumen to do is just get rid of this portion thing because I don't think anyone's really using it. People would rather know how many grams of carbs. So 5 times 15, so each portion of carbs is 15 grams. So 5 times 15 is 75 grams of carbs. I was a 3 run and it was a 2 afterwards. So it's good to know. So despite the fact that maybe I used about 200 grams of carbs on the run, that carbs is stored in my body, and I store about 2,000 grams or 2,000 calories of carbs in my body. So I've kind of heavily depleted my glycogen stores within my muscles, and I've topped it up just a little bit. If the run was longer than that, I would probably really need to fuel up with the carbs. And this is kind of like a fat adapted to carb adapted to how much carbs you're using kind of question, where the carbs that Lumen recommends are 75 grams. I will kind of recommend anything from 0.5 grams of carbs to 1 gram of carbs per minute of exercise. So that for me, 2 hours 21 is like 140 minutes ish of exercise. So half of that is about 70 grams of carbs. So between 70 grams of carbs to 140 grams of carbs roughly is what I would recommend for an endurance athlete going out. Now this depends if you're training for distance, endurance, performance, speeding up, slowing down, trying to become more fat adapted, or if you're just doing cardio for the sake of cardio, or if you're trying to diet at the same time, which is never really a good idea if you're trying to push distance. So I'm doing this month, I've stopped my diet phase. I'm really concentrating on this as my main prerogative. So I'm really trying to get in these carbohydrates and really trying to get the carbohydrates dialed in. So I'm not overeating because the last thing I want to do is gain weight by exercising more, but just getting my carbohydrates dialed in perfectly. Okay guys, on to the second part of the video, which is all about the crossover point, and then this will all come together as one piece. So here's a classic picture of the crossover point. So in the red line, you've got fat oxidation, which comes down the more intense the exercise gets, and you've got glucose oxidation, which increases the more you increase. And that crossover point is kind of your aerobic threshold. That's where you're switching from your aerobic system, which is more oxygen based, over to a more anaerobic system, which is more non-oxygen based. And anything past that crossover point, fat burn decreases rapidly and carbohydrate burn increases rapidly. But of course, you're only exercising for a certain amount of time, so 24 hours in a day. My run was over 2 hours, so over that 2 hours I'm sitting near that crossover point, slightly past it into more glucose based. But because I'll use up all my glucose post run, I'll start burning a lot more fat, which is one of the benefits of doing long duration cardio, is that you can burn through a ton of glucose, which means you can be in a fat burn for the rest of the day, but you will also probably feel that your carbohydrate need will increase and you'll be craving after, especially if you do a long endurance run. So this is something that you have to balance by keeping an overall eye on your total calories for the day, or total energy you're consuming for the day, so you don't go too nuts. But even post-run, because your glycogen stores are so low, any carbohydrates you eat there'll be a fight between your muscles soaking them in for storage and your cells for burning. So if you eat, say, 100 calories of carbohydrates, 25 grams of carbohydrates, your muscles will quickly absorb that and you'll return to fat burn fairly quickly, or you should return to fat burn fairly quickly depending on how insulin sensitive you are. So something I harp on about all the time is this zone 2 training. So zone 2 training is just before you get to this crossover point where fat burn is at its highest, and it actually teaches your mitochondria to burn more fat and they become more efficient at burning fat. So after you do something high intensity or anything that passes this crossover point, you're now going to be in a fat burn state. But if you're not particularly adapted in the zone 2 area, you're going to be stressing your body wildly. So loads of zone 2 training is important. And if we kind of look at the zone 2 training, so I've scribbled on here that in the little red arrows that I've scribbled on here, carbohydrates goes up, fat goes down, as we discussed in the previous slide. And where I've put these little blue X's, it's 50-50. So in the zone 2 space, it's 50% carbohydrates, 50% fat. So depending on how many calories you burn, so let's say you burned 1,000 calories, 500 from fat, 500 from carbs, roughly. Not everyone is the same, and some people are more fat adapted to others, as we'll discuss in a sec. So here's a little extract from what's called the FASTER study, and it was done on a guy called Zach Bitter, which is this ultra marathon runner that I use as an example all the time because he's a complete outlier. He's so good at burning fat. So his fat metabolism peaked at 1.5 grams per minute. We used to think that threshold of fat you could use per minute was 0.7. So this guy's burning 1.5 or 1.57. So the thing is, what does this mean? So if we look at Zach Bitter's VO2 max, so we've got 75%, 84%, and 96%. And at 75% of his VO2 max, which would be a fairly good running pace, he's using 98% fat usage and just 2% carb usage. So his crossover point is so much further on, as we'll see in the next slide. And at 84%, he's using a 76-24% fat to carbohydrate usage, which is huge. But even Zach Bitter, when he starts pushing that speed or pushing that hardness, his fat burn goes down to 23% to 77%. Most people at this 96% will be 100% carbohydrate usage. So even at that higher intensity, he's still using a ton of fat. But in his kind of slower, and when I say slower, that's probably still 6-minute-ish miles for Zach Bitter at that 74-75%. He's still going a good pace, and he's doing this over 100 miles. He's an absolute beast. His fat usage is absolutely incredible, and he does a ton of zone 2 work. So if we have a quick look at his crossover point, so the sort of red marks are his carbohydrate usage, and that blue line that kind of curves up, well, it's not a blue line, but it's got blue dots around it, that's his fat usage. So his fat usage peaks up really high, and then that crossover point is way further along than if we quickly check this slide again, where most people are around about that 50% of their intensity, they'll have that crossover point, where Zach Bitter's up at almost 80%, or he is pretty much just exactly at 80% where he has his crossover point. So he's highly fat adapted, which is where a lot of us should be looking to get to. He's of course a complete outlier, but I think most of us can get past this 50%. And even at light intensity work, using 50% fat and carbohydrates, which makes way more sense as a human, considering we only store about 2,000 calories of carbohydrates, but we store 3,500 calories in each pound of fat, and most of us have several pounds of fat available to us. So to conclude this whole video, here's a few things you need to do. You need to kind of find out where your zone 2 is, where this kind of crossover point is. That will give you an estimation of how much fat to carbohydrates you're using. You can make a random guess that most people are going to be kind of 50-50. Some people are going to be more fat adapted than others, and some people are going to be less fat adapted to others. But you can kind of guesstimate that. Lumen will give you carb recommendations. This is them. So you can kind of base your zone 2 on your heart rate, and the metric that I use is 170 minus your age. This works for about 80% of people, but doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work for me. The fitter you are, your heart rate can sit slightly higher than that. So my heart rate will sit at 145, ish, around about 140-ish is kind of where I'm at, and you can test this with an app called HRV Logger, which uses a thing called DFA Alpha 1. I made a video, I'll link it in here. That video will help you find your zone 2 without taking lactate testing. So once you've got your zone 2 worked out, you know how long you went out running for, you can get a kind of calorie burn. I use the Whoop app here, so my run was 1,800 calories. We could go that I went 50-50 fat and carbs, which is 900 calories from fat and 900 calories from carbohydrates. Divide that number by 4 because that's how many calories per gram is in carbohydrates, and that will give me how many grams of carbohydrates I maybe use, which is 225 grams of carbohydrates. The other thing you can use is your weight loss on the run. Depending on how much water you had in, you can get really technical, weigh yourself before, weigh yourself after, count how many milliliters you had. But I lost about 1 kilo on the run. Again, divide that by 4. So for each gram of glycogen you store a 3 grams of water. So again, divide your weight loss. So I lost 1 kilo on the run, divide that by 4, and that comes out at 250. So around about the 200 grams of carbohydrates I used. I fueled that with 20 grams on the carbs. I store about 400-500 grams of carbohydrates. So I was never really in danger of being super glycogen depleted, but about 50%. So the next 200 grams of carbohydrates that I eat should store in my muscles, and that's kind of what you're gonna be looking at. So if we look at this graph that I've just roughly written up here, so run 1 hour hard, then you eat, then you got your lumen levels, and this is what they kind of translate into. So 1 hour post run, are you a 5 or a 4? That means you're burning that and you're not very insulin sensitive, so you maybe need to dose your carbohydrates slower throughout the day, or do something to help that absorb in your body. Something like berberine can help you uptake the glucose, not having so much fat with the glucose so you don't slow that digestion. You can play about with different things. If you get 3, it's about 50-50. You're burning some, you're storing some, that's fine. And if you got 1 or 2, means you're mainly storing most of those carbohydrates. And then you can do that with each meal post run to kind of see where you're at, and that can plan your future fueling events coming forward. Depending if you run daily, if you run every 3 days, every 4 days, you can get quite technical with this. But this is how I use Lumen to plan endurance events, or use Lumen for endurance events. Hopefully that wasn't too technical. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe, and thanks for watching, and I'll check you guys on the next one.